Hello, everyone. So we're here inside the project Pathways, and the idea is to have different webinars during the different years of the project. So this is the second webinar, and to begin, we would like to propose to you just activities to present yourself. I can share. Okay, I can share my screen. Because the idea is to pin the country where you are currently working, and I will share a link inside the chat. So you can also even click on the link in the chat or scan the QR code on the screen. And then you will access to the activities, and you can put a dot on your country. Don't hesitate if you have questions, if it's not clear. I already see the dots coming. It's good. It's working for some people. I saw we are currently 30 participants. So we will wait 2 more minutes so you can have the chance to put your pen on the map. So we have lots of people from Europe. I can't zoom, but lots of people from Europe. And I thought it may be a little too small on the phone. I'm sorry about that. But it gives us an idea. And welcome to people outside Europe. Always nice to see you. Okay, maybe 1 more minute.
Someone calling in from Canada, a brave soul from transatlantic. Welcome. It's quite early for you, probably.
Okay, that's nice. I think we can close it. We almost have all the participants on the map. So lots of people from Europe. So welcome everybody, and thanks for playing these small activities to begin. Always nice to see where all people come from. And then I'll let the floor to Catherine to introduce the debate. And I can share my screen with the agenda if you want. I don't know, Stuart or Emma.
Yeah, go back to the main screen, please, Emma. Thank you, Amandine. I like doing that exercise because it shows where the attendees are calling in from. And last time we were very clustered in Northwestern Europe, and now we have a bit of a broader audience. So this is great. Catherine, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Pfeiffer. I work at the International, no, not at the International Research Institute, no, at the Institute of Organic Agriculture in Switzerland. And in Pathways, I do environmental modeling. And my focus is really about understanding what's the role of livestock in our food system and how that plays out. So for this webinar, we wanted to focus a little bit more and look at the role of livestock in mitigating and adapting to climate change. And we wanted to do that not just on this narrow focus we have in the Pathways Project on Europe, but open it up to the rest of the world and understand what are the perspectives from other places. And to do that, we lined up on the one hand, Todd Crane. Todd Crane is not just only a very appreciated former colleague of mine at the International Livestock Research Institute. He also is a principal investigator on climate adaptation, and he is also the head of ILRI's delegation to the COP. So I'm sure he can tell us a lot about climate smart livestock systems. To make sure that we just have a broader focus, we will have Alejandro as respondent. Alejandro works at Wageningen University. He's in, I need to check the group at the Farming Systems Group, where he also works on the Real Livestock Project, the follow-up project of Pathways that is looking at climate resilient livestock systems, and he's focusing on circular food systems. The way we're going to be organizing this today is that Todd will bring us his perspective from Africa to us, and then Alejandro will give an answer, and then we will try to go into a debate. So to do that, you have a Q&A chat box where you can ask your questions, and we will try to take them up and have a debate after the two presentations. Right? Todd, I think the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine, and to everyone from the Pathways Project for inviting me here today. I'm happy to be here. I'm becoming a bit unorthodox, and I'm not going to do a PowerPoint today. I'm going to kind of walk through a series of kind of discussion points. And what I want to do with this talk is not just to talk about climate smart livestock in the context of African production systems, but to talk about how the discourses that we see in Europe and industrial economies and food systems, how do we speak across the differences in discourses and production systems that we see there to get some perspective on variability around the world? So I think we can start with the observation that the meaning and sometimes even the very notion of climate smart livestock is hotly contested in many spaces. Some would propose that climate smart and livestock don't go together at all. So we're often in global media, we see a lot of messages about we need to eat less meat or less animal sourced foods, or maybe we need to eat no animal sourced foods. And whenever I see those, I always want to start with the question of which we are we talking about here? When we say we, where are the boundaries of that we? Because there's a lot of variability around the world, and I think we need to account for that variability in solutions and in climate smart development pathways. Starting from a somewhat personal perspective, as someone who's been vegetarian for around 30 years and increasingly vegan, and with some occasional exceptions, I might be seen as an unlikely person to be working at the International Livestock Research Institute, and maybe even a more unlikely head of ILRI's delegation to the COP, where we make the case for the importance of livestock development and animal source foods as a part of climate solutions in Africa. And all of my content today will focus on Africa, but these issues are, again, vary in other places around the world. But I propose that these positions aren't so incompatible or inconsistent as they may seem at first blush. They simply acknowledge that the pathways for climate solutions must vary with the contexts. So advocating for reduction of animal source foods production and consumption in industrial economies is perfectly compatible with advocating for increased animal source food production and consumption in agrarian economies, which comes around back to this question about which we are we talking about when we talk about what the relationship between animal source foods and production and climate solutions. And I want to walk through a few different elements of that characterize the role of livestock in African production systems. And I'm going to use that very broad, but we know that production systems across Africa do vary widely. Starting with agroecologies, in the arid rangelands across Africa, pastoralism, of course, has been an integral part of the human ecology for several millennia. This is not a new introduction. This has been there for thousands of years, mimicking and generally integrating with the movements and ecological dynamics of wild grazing animals, and converting grass into nutrition and livelihoods for human sociocultural systems. Within livestock within smallholder systems, more mixed crop livestock, we see livestock that are not only a productive resource, but they're multifunctional socio-ecological integrators. They serve functions of cycling crop waste and grass into nutrition, manure, labor in terms of traction, financial savings in many cases, and of course as important social exchange mechanisms. So these are all part of what livestock are doing in the socio-ecological systems in various ways. So when we assess the value of livestock in these systems, we cannot simply look at meat and milk, but we need to look at it in this holistic sense of how does the livestock exist, both ecologically and socioeconomically. Staying in the topic of agroecologies, if we look at the soils across much of Africa, especially in the arid and semi-arid regions, agriculture relies heavily on manure as a central input to improve soil organic carbon, supporting increased water retention, soil fertility, and thus agricultural production. So again, it is not siloed away from agriculture, but it's an integral part of agriculture. And of course, manure as an agricultural input in these sorts of systems is not substitutable by chemical fertilizers easily. And as such, especially in organic agriculture across much of Africa, manure and thus livestock become a really central source of inputs. And so when we compare this, bounce this back off of the proposal that we need to be producing and consuming less livestock, I would propose that ceasing livestock production, livestock keeping would substantially disrupt socio-ecological systems and make sustainable or organic agriculture untenable in much of Africa. When we look at the role of livestock in livelihoods across Africa, there are an estimated 268 million pastoralists whose livelihoods and nutrition rely heavily, in many cases exclusively, on livestock. And this is just pastoralists who follow herds in a transhumant or migratory path. In addition to that, there's around over 500 million people in mixed crop livestock agricultural systems where livestock form an integral part and perform multiple functions as previously mentioned. So within this context of livelihoods, ceasing or reducing livestock systems would deprive 800 million people, and this is in Africa alone, of livelihoods where few other options exist, where the industrial economies and service economies aren't so well developed. Zooming out in terms away from livelihoods, but to broader economies, across Africa, livestock constitute an average of 40% of the gross domestic products of African countries. This ranges heavily, of course, from 10% to up as high as 80% of the gross domestic product comes from the livestock sector. And the higher the figure is typically found in the arid Sahelian countries where industrial and other non-agricultural economies aren't as well developed. So when we see a more vibrant and broad-based economy, that percentage goes down, but it's a hugely important part of national economies. And finally, in the topic of nutrition. Across Africa, the per capita annual consumption of milk and meat is estimated at around 14 kilos of meat and 30 liters of milk. Now, that's an average, and this is already well below most nutritional recommendations, which of course have their own politics and variability, and it is extremely far below the averages in industrial food systems. And I really want to emphasize that these 14 kilos per person per year of meat and 30 liters of milk per person per year, these are averages. Of course, wealthier people are going to consume more and poorer people are going to consume much less. So what we see is that animal source foods are nutrient dense in providing critical protein, vitamins, and micronutrients that are not otherwise readily available for many people across food systems. This is, of course, not socially distributed, or this is socially distributed quite broadly, with many people, even to this day, having extreme nutrient deficiency and nutritional insecurity. And the micronutrient issue is especially important in the first 3 years of life, when nutrient deficiencies can lead to really long-term stunting and negative impacts on both physical and cognitive development. So in this context, I would say that reducing animal-sourced foods would lead to nutritional deprivation and a lot of the across rural Africa, and indeed school milk programs to try and get a cup of milk a day into children's diets on a regular basis have made significant impacts in terms of their ability to focus and benefit from education, just as an indicator of impacts on cognitive development. Now, these are just some of the broad categories where I think we need to pay attention to how different pathways of climate solutions involve and respond to and integrate livestock. But to put all this in perspective, Africa contains approximately 17% of the global population, but is responsible for around 4%, most estimates are a little bit less, 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, Africa is bearing much of the brunt of climate change impact and continues to struggle to keep a pace with those climate change impacts with adaptation interventions. So going back to the which we are we talking about when proposals are made that we need to eat fewer livestock products and we need to stop producing, subsidizing and producing livestock-based foods, are African livestock systems or food systems the places we should prioritize for pursuing the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions? And which we needs to reduce animal source food production and consumption in the interest of climate change? And how do we account for the different pathways and different sorts of approaches and priorities and actions that these differences imply between industrial food systems and agrarian food systems? And at that, I would like to pass the mic to Alejandro.
Thank you so much, Todd. Before giving the word to Alejandro, I'll give him a second to think about it. There has been some question of content, so I felt maybe you can answer them directly. The first question was, what is the percentage of the fraction of the, I think it's about income of livestock production compared to the total agricultural production in probably Africa, or maybe you want to break it down to some specific countries? Do you know that? So how important is the livestock production within the total agricultural production?
It's huge. I'm going to struggle to come up with the exact figure, but in many places it's over 50% of the value. If you look at the overall, in a national economy, the value produced in agriculture, Livestock constitute a very large part of that, the majority in many cases. In terms of household economies, obviously it varies widely how you estimate it, but for pastoralists, 268 million people in Africa alone, this is up to 100% of their household economy comes from from livestock production and sales.
Thank you, Todd, for this answer. Alejandro, what passes through your mind when you hear Todd explaining how important livestock is on the African continent?
Yes, thank you for giving me the word. Thanks, Todd, also for the nice points that you shared in the presentation. So, yeah, I think I have a few points to share. Indeed, I fully agree on the question on we talking about, like which we, right? And I would say like the reduction of animal source foods should come from those that are over-consuming it. And that doesn't only mean that are people from industrial economies, but also outside industrial economies, there is also, different income levels and different dietary patterns, I would say. So it should be for those who are over-consuming it. And then the question is, how much is over-consuming, right? And yeah, I mean, you will find a lot of estimates from literature. Now, I know that like easy approaches that people can attach to are, for example, if current diets you're getting your protein, 60% of your protein is coming from animals and 40% from the plants, let's try to switch it. Like these kind of easy ratios that are been trying to be communicated to the general public. Regarding livelihoods, also I fully agree, like pastoralist systems are very valuable systems also in terms of socio-ecological knowledge, right? And it has been there for millennia, and that's probably one of the most efficient uses of the scarce resources that are in those lands sometimes. So in that sense, also we have them in South America. We have also pastoralist system for camelids, so llamas and alpacas, and unfortunately they are being reduced and changed by sheep, for example. But yeah, those systems are highly valuable, and they really make a use of those lands where you cannot produce crops, let's say. So that's where we should invest, I think, on helping them with our means to adapt to climate change with early alarm systems and all sort of kind of technology-driven innovations that could help to make them pass through the climate crisis. And for mixed crop systems, the same. Like these are multi-purpose systems, and it's really unfair to compare them in terms of yields or greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product versus a fully industrialized system, right? It's like comparing a really fast car with a big truck for maximum speed, while they are designed for different purposes. And manure, yeah, plays a key role for fertilization. This is really evident that actually the plots, the small plots that are around the houses of the farmers are those performing the best, and it's because the manure is being applied on those lands. But where the problem starts, I think, it's when we talk about industrialized and specialized livestock systems. Indeed, livestock is part of many countries' economies. It's an important part of let's say, the GDP. But then the question is, if we want to make it grow, because people need to consume more livestock products, that has also consequences, right? Of course, it can supply some nutrients for the population because livestock is a nutrient-dense food, etc. But also, and I think that's the main issue, is the feed. Where do you take the feed from? Because to produce feed, you need arable lands. And in those arable lands, you could be producing also food for direct human consumption. And also the feed production is often associated to the change of natural ecosystems by agrarian ecosystems. And that also has consequences on the food security of the people of those places, right? So that's, I think, where the problem starts a bit on like, if we think in the future, we have to produce more livestock. If that's really the the aim, then yeah, that will have consequences, and you need feed for that. And if not done properly, then that's for sure an issue that can cause also food security issues and degradation in other places. So ideally, at least that is what we work on in FSC and in the CFOS team, the Circular Food Systems Modeling team, is that we try to, with models, we try to predict what is the amount of livestock that could be sustainably reproduced. And for the feed, we account for feeding livestock with residues, like not only crop residues, but also, for example, pigs can be fed on food waste, agri-food residues. You also have them available, like, for example, these dry distillers products. I don't know, there are some sort of residues in the economies that could be fed to livestock instead of feeding them with raw materials. And then, yeah, if we can find out how much animals we could keep in that way, which animals also, because yeah, not all of them are suitable for eating, let's say, residues. You need new breeds probably, or the traditional breeds that actually now are underrated. And that's the question, like what animals and what we should feed them, what we should feed them, those animals, and how many of we, and this will change depending on where you are. And the idea is not to extend agricultural land, because we already know that that has negative consequences also for food production, food security, and the climate and biodiversity, and etc. Lastly, on the topic of nutrition, yeah, I mentioned already before, livestock nutrient-dense foods full of vitamin B12, iron, very important for in populations where there is a deficiency of iron and anemia, which is common in many places, for example, in Peru, where I come from. But also what we did in the past was to look a bit on these alternative foods that are coming out, like insects, seaweed, fungi, and see if those key nutrients that are in livestock products are also in those new products. And we review the literature. We also assess different life cycle assessments to see the environmental impact. And what we could find was that the nutrients are present, like some of them even in much higher amounts than in animal products. The land use is usually lower as well with these future foods. But of course, you need a new supply chain, and you need technology and yeah, new knowledge also to produce them. So this is not something that will happen for tomorrow. But it's important to keep that in mind, that there are also other alternatives that with the right incentives could be promoted to also overcome nutrition deficiencies aside to livestock. Yes. I think that's are my main points. I hope
Thank you, Alejandro.
They stimulate the discussion.
A great contribution. Todd, do you want to react to this, or shall we go to questions?
Yeah, I'll throw out a few reactions. No, I think by and large we're talking from the same book here. And I really appreciate, Alejandro, you pointing out that it's not just about geographies and countries, but it's about who within any given country is consuming what, because we know in the end it's not about geography, it's about wealth. And wealth is unevenly distributed at a global sense, but it's also unevenly distributed within any given country. And I think this really highlights one of the major questions in terms of sustainability of ruminant production, is that it's not so much, if we really want to pay attention to the addressing nutritional benefits and especially the nutritional deficits, I think we need to pay less attention to production, and not just more and more and more, but pay attention to distribution. How does that nutrition reach the people who need it most, and how, and I would love to hear the audience just start to discuss this, but how can we incentivize reduced consumption by people who are wealthy enough to consume in excess, so that that can reach. And what we see in industrial economies is that the scale of production has gone so high that the cost has come down so low that it can reach more people. I don't think that's a sustainable pathway. I don't think it's a sustainable pathway in industrial economies, and I don't think it's a sustainable pathway in African economies. But that's a tricky one because mandating distribution of consumption and gets into controlled economies, and that's a very large can of worms. Absolutely right on the issue of the consequences of expanding livestock systems in terms of where do you get the feed from. In the end, I think we need to be the mid-range future and long-range future of livestock systems needs to be driven not by the number of animals, but by the amount of feed that can be grown sustainably. And sometimes that's on-farm feed production. Sometimes that's the growth of intensive feed at a larger scale. The land use change is, of course, the big concern, and that's an issue even within the Kenyan economy. But managing the ratio between sustainably produced feed and the number of animals that can support in more intensive systems, I think, is the big question. In pastoral systems, it's a different issue. It's the ratio of animals to feed, but it's with the spatial and temporal variability that comes with the arid rangelands, combined with the challenges of collective tenure and the necessity of mobility, because of the heterogeneous nature of rangeland production, because of heterogeneous rainfall and such variability between years. Pastoralism in the drylands needs to move around, and doing it in enclosed ranches is really not going to be tenable in the long or even medium term. And finally, yes, I like that you introduced the question of non-ruminant based alternative proteins and micronutrients from the black soldier fly and others. I would add, in addition to getting the knowledge and the value chains and production up, is how do you work these into food systems, into cuisines? Because it's one thing for it to be there, but for nutrition to reach people's bodies, they need to eat it, which means they need to prepare it into a meal that they're motivated to consume. And that's a challenge. It's both a marketing challenge, but also an aesthetic challenge in terms of working that in. I don't see that as a likely mainstream solution in the near or middle term in African systems, but I think it is an issue, and even here in Kenya now, there are some startups working in black soldier fly as a input for dog food. It's not for people food yet, but it's for dog food. But this is a very niche luxury market, obviously. But the seeds are there for these sorts of things going on. So yeah, that's a few responses to those good topics raised, and I'm excited to open up to the audience and really see where we can take the conversation.
I'll start with that because Todd, you are saying that in Africa it's not a trade-off, it's a win-win. We can have more animal source food without really increasing the emissions or without being a real threat to climate.
I didn't say that exactly.
Well, let me go further. I want to explore that trade-off, and you say, well, we should have an amount of sustainable produced feed, and that should define our number of animals. However, the African population is the one that is still growing. So, did we already pass that threshold? Can we still nourish Africa sustainably, or do we have already too much population?
I think the
threshold. Did we pass the threshold yet, or not?
I mean, I think the next 30 years of agricultural change and agricultural development, and that's in general, not just in livestock, but especially in livestock, is not going to be a linear trajectory from the last 30 years. There is stress in the system, and there are mechanisms in play, whether they're ecological or socio-institutional, where change will happen. But I think for me, the really important message here is to zoom in and zoom out. We see the global problem relating to livestock sourced foods and food systems. And I think there are some very legitimate critiques in that. But it's contextual where they apply to. And I'm really happy we did this mapping exercise at the beginning, because it's quite clear that we're talking to a very European audience. And having been working in ag development in Africa more than 20 years now, and at ILRI on climate change issues for more than 10 years now, we've really encountered an aversion. Well, no, let me rephrase that. We've encountered a reluctance of European institutions and European countries and donors to invest in African livestock systems because of the critiques that they're internalizing back home. Not appreciating that the production systems, the food systems here are very different. This 17% of the population versus 4% of the global emissions is, I think, really telling that this is not a place where we have mass inefficiency and heavy overproduction. That adaptation is a much higher priority here because of nutritional and food insecurity, and because this isn't where the emissions are coming from. So that the solutions can't be universal, and the export of the critiques and solutions that we see coming, say, from Europe to Africa is wildly inappropriate, and I think would create very adverse outcomes.
I think there's a very nice question in the chat, which we could take up right now. It's from Lisa Norton, and she says, it is about less and better for non-agrarian societies. Can animal welfare issues and ecosystem service delivery required from farmed land turn into tied towards more expensive meat in those parts of the world? So basically, it's about when we have better livestock, it's going to be more expensive. How is that going to play out for the African continent?
Economy of scale is a real thing, and I'm not going to offer a pat solution here today. And indeed, even this dichotomy that I've started with between say, industrial meat production, animal source food production, and African animal source food production is a bit false, because there is interplay between the livestock sourced food markets in Africa and industrial markets. Milk powder is a big one. It's a very big one. I think the export of chicken wings from Northern Europe to Africa because Europeans only want to eat the breasts. And so they export them en masse to coastal West Africa, and it really disrupts, say, the chicken market there, the endogenous chicken market. So yeah, we need to attend to those interplays and how economies of scale play out. Andrew, maybe you have some insights on that one.
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't have numbers, but just have a reflection that in the places in which we already have mixed livestock systems that are produced kind of in an agroecological way, right? Those products are commercialized in the surroundings. They usually don't get to cities because it's so expensive to transport them. And also the industrial, let's say, milk products also don't get too often there because it's also expensive because you need to pay the transportation cost. So yeah, I mean, in these, let's say, more rural areas, I would say that people consume locally what they produce, and often that's, I mean, it's really general. Depending where you are, probably.
I've even 25 years ago in fairly remote rural Mali, yeah, people would use milk powder because it's cheaper and it's easier. You don't have to, it doesn't go bad. You don't have to buy it every day. You don't have to wait for it. You just have a tin of it that you keep around and you put it in your borage. So yeah, I mean, the reach of those convenience especially milk powder being a dried food, is the convenience factor gives it a huge reach. For fresh milk and fresh meat, it's a different story.
Okay.
There's an ongoing debate ongoing in the chat, so some people put their comments. So you feel free to check on them. I think they're quite in line with the debate we're having. I picked another one which opens a bit a new dimension from Lawrence, the coordinator of the Pathways project, and he's asking to both panelists, how do we equip the next generation of researchers to assess the food system impact more effectively?
I just give a short answer, but I think it has to do a lot with the systems approach.
Yeah.
System thinking is key, and for that you need, multidiscipline teams, let's say education teams and projects, people from different perspectives, and also to keep the quantitative basis, because we have lots of innovations, but we really need to know how much they could change things. We need to know, flows, like amounts, right? To not stay only on, yes, this feed could make the livestock sector more sustainable. Okay, but what is the availability of the feed? Is it really substantial, or is it not? Like this, to have really in mind that, the dimension of the solutions. And for that, we need a systems approach. Every innovation have consequences, right? And we need to assess them. And that's where we need to put attention on the system thinking.
Yeah, I reiterate, the systems thinking and the multidisciplinary perspectives. Because we can get into rumen microbiology is an important part of it, but we also need political economy and food systems. That's a part of it. And there are many, many others. So to be able to conceptualize the problem from 7 different angles, and is in a systems approach is useful, and to be able to talk, but be able to specialize in a disciplinary angle that it still gives you a strong academic perspective to bring to the table, and being able to talk across those is hugely important. I would add, though, and with systems thinking, the one thing we sometimes overlook with systems thinking is that systems are always differentiated. That there's a lot of different positions within that system, and we can have something that looks good as a system, but within any system, there are typically winners and losers. And so paying attention to social equity questions and distributional equity and the distributed benefits within that system needs to be a part of that. And that gets into some trade-off questions, that gets into, in many cases, reducing optimality in the interest of equity. And in those contexts, in many cases, there's no right answer, there are trade-offs. And so grappling with the trade-offs question, I think, is important for the next generation of researchers.
If that's okay, there is a statement here which I find quite interesting. I would read it to you, and it raises some of the more systemic questions, and I would love to get a reaction from you on those. The growing population talk is being used by industrialized countries to excuse the increase in intensification and higher use of input, and potentially result in poor animal welfare. But are there food things are moving here, sorry. But are there food achieving the countries that need it, and should they? What about food security inside those countries? Todd, can you give us some evidence?
No, this is a really live discussion. I had some lively discussions with people from, say, industrial animal agriculture at the COP about this. So if we just want to bracket away production and look at production efficiency, the industrial economies are better at production efficiency. But if we start to look at the livelihood opportunities, if we can look in other sectors and see what that production efficiency does to the livelihoods in these sectors. So if if all of the meat for Africa was produced in Europe, what is that? That's one more livelihood activity that's not available to people. That is possible for them here. If we look at the clothing sector, the ready availability of secondhand clothes from industrial economies is really gutted clothing production in Africa. So the Africa focused clothing production becomes boutique and less accessible. So yeah, there are knock-on effects there, and this is a major trade-off in this discussion of maintaining viable livelihoods and local value chains around products that can be produced in Africa is an important part of the solution. So it can't just be about production efficiency, as tempting as that is.
You want to continue with the question, shall we continue to produce more in industrial countries to feed countries?
I think I already sort of touched on it, is that there are trade-offs there, but we already see that the global political economy around food is such that there are already some major interdependencies, and those have benefits in terms of feeding people, but they also create vulnerabilities. So when rice crops fail in Southeast Asia, that creates food insecurity in West Africa, because there's a heavy reliance on Asian import of rice. And as people get wealthier, there's a shift toward rice and wheat-based diets, away from the millets and sorghums, away from some of these other staple crops which are endogenous in Africa. So yeah, but at the same time, when there was a maize shortage in Kenya some years ago, it was Mexican maize that came and saved the day, that filled the gap. So again, there are trade-offs to these interdependencies, and there are not going to be any easy right answers.
Excellent. There is a question you mentioned you wanted to answer, which is very content. About climate research in Africa. Are there any studies recording emissions from greenhouse gases from real-world livestock system in Africa, and how do they compare to standard assumptions? I'm sure you can say something.
I would be remiss if I did not answer this question, because ILRI has for the last 10 years had an environmental research lab focused on this very objective. Generating greenhouse gas emissions factors based on actual measurements from actual African livestock systems. To our knowledge, this is really the first ever that this has been done. As you say, that's previously been built on IPCC estimates based on industrial systems. The preliminary, the findings that are coming out of this vary. In some cases, the emissions factors are higher. In some cases, the emission factors are substantially lower. But it really does emphasize the importance of having emission factors that are actually based on real data, so that we know when we start to play around with low emission development practices in the livestock sector, we have some baseline upon which to estimate how they're being used. So that is being done. At ILRI, please reach out to me if you want more context around that question. Or you can look up the Mazingira Center at ILRI. Type that in the chat in case no one knows how to spell Mazingira.
Very good. Todd, there's a very interesting question that arises here. Well, when we talked about these industrial European systems and you talked about African systems, what could African system teach Europe? And what can we gain in regards to biodiversity and management of land and movement of herds?
Teach Europe. You caught me off guard. That's a good one. No, I think we see in the mixed crop livestock systems, especially ones where they grow their own fodder on site, So it's internalizing fodder production. Getting at Alejandro's topic of the consequences of managing feed production sustainably, we see that the production efficiency in these smallholder systems can actually be quite high. I mean, typically we say the efficiency in industrial systems is high, smallholder systems are less efficient. But some of our recent work has been showing that, in particular, smallholder systems that really manage their own feed, that produce their own feed, sometimes it's hay, sometimes it might even be some variation of concentrate, that they can really get high production efficiencies there. It's a little bit more labor and knowledge intensive, and skill intensive, but it can be done. That this dichotomy of smallholder is inefficient is really glossing over some complexity.
But as far as I understand, Alejandro was saying, well, we shouldn't use arable land to produce feed for livestock. Well, you seem now to say, well, but listen, in smallholder systems, we see the gain is quite big in terms of efficiency. So are you suggesting that we should still use a little bit of arable land, especially in smallholder systems?
I think I am.
You are?
I think I am.
Have an answer to that.
I mean, for alfalfa or I mean, I think it's not a yes or no question. It depends on how much land you allocate for each activity, and like if you only feed animals with residues, sometimes adding a bit of main product, then it can make really a big of a difference. But I would say really context dependent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's the essence of this entire talk. It's very context dependent. Mm-hmm. But no, in principle, I agree is that, converting arable land at a large scale for commercial hay production, for example, comes with some fairly serious consequences. But integrating it into a smallholder system where it's part of a rotation, it's part of an integrated system, it creates different environmental outcomes.
Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe something just to add, maybe not from livestock production systems in compared to. So the question was about if Europe can learn something from African systems, and I just wanted to add the intercropping part. That in lots of smallholder societies, intercropping is practiced. That's the practice of mixing two different crops or even two different cultivars, right? So not to avoid a monoculture, but have, I don't know, strips or have patches of different crops. And now, at least this is a hot topic here in Wageningen and in the Netherlands, the strip cropping farming that wants to be mainstream due to all the benefits that it has for biodiversity and also for biological control, less pests and herbivores, etc. So that's also something nice to see that there seems to be hopefully a switch towards those like mixed crop systems, which are common in the tropics, I would say.
I'm sorry, I'm overwhelmed with the amount of questions that are coming in right now.
Great.
There was one that was actually at the very beginning of that avalanche, which was actually to Alejandro asking, well, the E-Lancet is noted for taking a very negative stance on animal source food. What would be more appropriate sources for a healthy diet? And I hope then I catch up with all the other questions in the meantime.
Yeah, well, I know they are doing a second report this year. Still don't know the amounts that will come out there. But other sources, the EFSA maybe from the European Union, but we usually work with Lancet in our model. And every country also has its own food dietary guideline, but that's also a topic, right? Like food dietary guidelines are often made based on health outcomes. So, and not always on sustainability. So that's something also we explore in our group, how much it differs if you set the boundary towards only nutrition using a food-based dietary guideline from a country, or if you use a dietary guideline that also takes into account the sustainability part, and you will probably find different results. I don't know what's the argument to say that it's too low for Lancet. Maybe that's also a topic for discussion. Like, what is low and what is high, and who who puts that limit?
Yes, sorry, I'm a bit overwhelmed here. Shall I just move on? There's one question to all panelists, which is looking at these alternative meat productions, such as plant-based and lab-grown meat, to be efficient. Is it healthy and reliable? And would it be socially acceptable, especially in an African context? What do you see? You said that we would feed that to dogs, but do you see it coming?
Well, it depends which it is. I'm not personally integrating black soldier fly into my diet in the foreseeable future, but I'm open-minded. I've lived in Nairobi for 10 years and some now. Within the Kenyan context and my own particular strange position within it, I see those would be kind of boutique niche products in the next 5 or 10 years. That's wealthy people with certain values and aesthetics might go for, but I don't see those becoming even financially viable within the broader food system anytime soon. The question about their nutritive qualities I cannot speak to, but I have been reading there's still some questions about whether lab-grown is going to capture all the nutrition that animal-grown meat would provide. But this is not my specialty, so I'm reluctant to go too far on that one.
Hanno, you have something you want to add about the topic?
Yeah, on insects, because I worked before with insects. It depends also, again, who are the consumers. In some countries in the world, like in Mexico, for example, grasshoppers are consumed like by people. Also in the Peruvian Amazon, also some caterpillars are consumed, and in Thailand, etc. There are a lot of people already consume insects, but now if we want to get into board to new consumers, again, depends what types of consumers, but you don't have to eat the live larvae. Maybe you can eat a yogurt that is made of larvae protein instead of milk powder in the future. Or I don't know, there are hamburgers also there. For insects, the nutritional quality depends a lot on what you feed them. Protein is quite stable, but fat change a lot depending on the type of feed that you give them. And other nutrients are also only there if you put them in the feed, like omega-3 fatty acids, for instance. They will not produce them by themselves. If you put it fish residues, then they will get it. And with cultured meat, yeah, I mean, we did an LCA a few years ago on that, and we had to make a lot of assumptions on the nutritional composition because it was just simply not available. And the claim is that you can kind of custom made the meat depending on what you want, but of course that needs input. If you want more calcium, you need to add the calcium. If you want more vitamin B12, you need to add the vitamin B12. So yes, and the LCAs out there, even the recent ones, they make a lot of assumptions because data is not shared or not available yet. So there's still big uncertainty about it.
Thanks, Alejandro. On the question Q&A section, there's a lot of people starting to really ask about what can we learn from Africa. And there's 2 of them. So one of them is the last one has been posted, which says great answers to what we can learn from Africa. And unfortunately, and that seems to be in Denmark, think that it is going back to to something we've evolved away from. So maybe we have the answers in our archive. Did Todd mention some studies showing high efficiency in smallholder farming methods? Do you have that in mind, Todd? That's the first question you can answer quickly, and then the second one that goes around that is, and what do we learn from the pastorals? What can we learn from the pastoral systems that has always worked where humans and animals have always been very near to each other?
I did mention such a thing. I will have to dig that publication out. This was from my colleagues at the Mazingira Center. I noticed that I posted that name, but it's only to the panelists and not the whole group. So maybe Catherine, you can repost.
Or maybe Amandine can help us with that.
Yeah, on the coexistence of pastoral livestock systems with natural ecosystems. I mean, I hesitate to call them natural ecosystems. They're human ecosystems, and they've been human ecosystems for millennia. We've been, as animals, doing our thing. We've been a part of it forever. It's not a dichotomy, and it's never been a dichotomy, though our role in it has changed. The main thing that makes pastoralism work in the drylands is mobility. If things are bad where you are, then you leave and you go somewhere else. That's the essence of pastoralism as a cultural adaptation to environment. However, under current conditions with much higher populations than there were 1,000 or even 100 years ago, and national borders and security issues and all these things, it's not what it was, and it's not going to be what it was. And there are some major issues at present around sustainable rangeland management or rangeland degradation and incentives that drive those changes. But it's also important to keep in mind that pastoralism as a cultural adaptation, pastoralism is a subsistence milk system. It's not about meat production. Pastoralists don't eat meat that often, but they live off the milk because it's free. And you don't have to do away with any of your productive resources or assets to have it. It's just free. Up until half a century ago, and maybe a bit longer, the Maasai subsistence diet was a mix of blood and milk, and that's a potent mix of nutrients, and you can live off of that for a long time. But again, this is not a commercial meat production system, and it never was. So it's important not to over-romanticize it, but it shows that there is a model for sustainable integration of livestock in a broad ecology. Questions are indeed coming fast.
There's a follow-up question on that, and would those ecosystems be able to function better without the pastoralist input?
If you removed pastoralism from the African rangelands, it would change. Not radically, because again, they typically mimic the migrations of animals in as much as they're able to migrate. It's the inability of pastoralists to migrate that in many cases leads to land degradation. And that's inability, and sometimes it's disincentives to migrate. So no, I would not agree with that statement necessarily.
I see time running, and I also see there's not too many questions coming. So I thought I'll give a quick summary, and then I have a final question to both panelists. We started this debate, at the beginning, saying that in Africa, there might be a win-win when it comes to livestock and climate. We've also explored that there's a maximum carrying capacity for livestock, and it is unclear whether we have passed that. And I heard you, Todd, say, well, the biggest challenge for the future generation is to be able to address those trade-offs. And at a certain stage, as population, especially in Africa, grows, there will be trade-offs. So that we will need to choose, is the nutrition of poor people more important to the environment or to the development of those countries? If you had to choose for one, given the trade-off, which one would you focus on and why?
Keeping us on our toes, Catherine.
Sorry?
You said you're keeping us on our toes.
Yes, absolutely. That was my task.
I mean, I would actually, I'm looking back at some of the questions here, and there's a comment from Bianca Costa about sustainability and greenhouse gases. That sustainability is much more than greenhouse gases. Because if sustainability without, from an environmental point of view, that doesn't provide nutrition, doesn't provide decent livelihoods, dignified work, we could go on and on. It's not sustainability. That has to be multifaceted. Because environmental sustainability without socioeconomic sustainability is not sustainability, would be my position. So it has to be, and this goes back to our conversation earlier with Alejandro, is that we need a system perspective. We need multiple disciplines looking at there. We need to be able to talk about the trade-offs and complementarity. And I think this is something I've arrived to, especially in working at ILRI's. A lot of low emission livestock development practices we're seeing come at a cost to women's opportunities. This is especially in the Kenyan dairy sector we found. So with commercialization and intensification, that disenfranchises especially women dairy producers from their income streams because of social mechanisms. We can address those social mechanisms as a part of a climate smart intervention. And I think that's totally on point. But we also need to acknowledge that optimizing greenhouse gas emissions at the cost of people's livelihoods and disenfranchising entire classes of people from their livelihoods, maybe we can dial back our environmental targets, especially in a place where the environmental impact of livestock is so low, especially from a GHG point of view. And say, well, actually having viable livelihoods when there are so few other options available, that's more important. Which is a hard sell because so often the measurement of success is that we've moved the needle on greenhouse gas measurements, and it's a very alluring metric. But we need to look at multiple metrics to gauge success.
Alejandro, do you want to add to that, or is that a good final word?
No, I think it's a good final word. Yes.
So I would,
and it's just, to me, it's just this. I don't know if it's a trade-off, but it's a bit. How can we, using a systems approach and being open, how can we really agree on which livestock systems to really support and invest on them and help them to adapt, and in which other sectors we need to make changes, and it comes with the industrialized sector and specialized systems, high input systems. It's a bit of a tricky situation, really, because they produce a lot. People also need them, but they also have really negative consequences in the medium term, I would say. So that's where the tricky question and line it is for me.
So I want to thank both of you for entering this debate and showing us that there will be no easy solution, but the systems approach we will need the systems approach to find the solutions that avoid or that helps us mitigating the trade-offs. I think it's a dialogue that we will continue. And with that, I will hand over to Stuart to close this webinar.